Today's video, we're diving into ancient Rome conspiracy theories that history has proven true, and, trust me, some of these will completely change how you see the Roman Empire. But before we uncover these hidden truths, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss more fascinating stories from history. And hey, while you're watching, drop a comment below. Which ancient mystery do you think is still unsolved? Alright, let's step back in time and uncover the secrets Rome tried to bury. What if some of the wildest conspiracy theories about ancient Rome were actually true, not rumors, not legends, but real secrets hidden for centuries, and only uncovered through archaeology, lost texts, and shocking discoveries? From emperors who may have staged events for power, to mysterious deaths that don't quite add up. Ancient Rome wasn't just a civilization of glory and conquest. It was a world full of secrets, deception, and stories that sound almost unbelievable. And the craziest part, some of the theories people once dismissed as pure imagination turned out to be real. If you close your eyes and picture ancient Rome, you probably see something clean, strong, orderly, straight roads stretching into the distance, soldiers marching in perfect rhythm, senators in white robes debating laws that would shape the world. Rome, the great machine of order, that's the version most people know. But here's the quiet truth. That version was carefully built. Because behind the marble statues and perfect speeches, Rome was something else entirely. Something messier, something darker, and far more human. At its surface, Rome called itself a republic, a place where power was shared, where no single man ruled, where laws mattered more than ambition. It sounded good. It felt stable, but if you look a little closer, the cracks start to show. Power wasn't shared equally. It never is. A handful elite families controlled almost everything: wealth, land, armies, even public opinion. If you were born outside that circle, your chances of rising were slim. Not impossible, but dangerous. Because Rome didn't just reward ambition, it punished it too. Here's something they didn't put in the speeches. Roman politics was not polite. It wasn't calm debates in quiet rooms. It was shouting. Threats, bribes passed in the shadows. Deals made over dinner, then broken the next morning, and sometimes it was violence, real violence. Politicians were attacked in the streets. Elections were influenced by gangs. Rivals disappeared, not officially, of course. Officially, Rome was civilized. That was always the story. And that's where things get interesting, because the Romans were very, very good at controlling the story. They understood something most people don't think about. If you control what people believe, you don't always need to control what actually happens. You just need to shape the narrative. Think about it. There were no news channels, no social media, no independent reporters checking facts. Information moved slowly, and it moved through people who had something to gain. Senators, generals, writers who depended on powerful patrons. So when something big happened, assassination, a sudden death, a political shifted version that spread, wasn't always the truth. It was the version that survived, the version that was allowed to survive, and sometimes people noticed. Sometimes, even in ancient Rome, there were whispers, quiet conversations, raised eyebrows, stories that didn't quite add up. People would say things like that wasn't an accident, or that man didn't just die, or even this isn't a republic anymore. But those ideas, those suspicions, they were often dismissed, called rumors, called paranoia, or called conspiracy, And yet, here's the strange part. Many of those conspiracies didn't stay rumors forever. Over time, as historians looked closer, as more sources were studied, as patterns became clearer, some of those wild ideas started to look reasonable, even likely. Sometimes they turned out to be true, not always in the dramatic way people imagined. There were no secret underground chambers full of cloaked figures whispering over candles. Rome wasn't a movie, but it didn't need to be, because real power doesn't usually look dramatic. It looks quiet. It looks like a dinner invitation, a marriage alliance, a sudden promotion, or a sudden death. And the more you look at Rome through that lens, the more everything starts to shift. Events that once seemed simple become complicated stories that felt clear, become blurry. Heroes start to look a little more calculating. Villains start to look a little more misunderstood. Take the idea of justice. Rome loved to talk about justice. Laws carved into stone, courts, trials, public speeches about fairness, but justice in Rome depended heavily on who you were. A powerful man could bend the system, a poor man could be crushed by it, and if you had the right connections, the right allies, the right amount of influence, you could rewrite what justice meant. Now add ambition to that system, add pride, add fear, add the constant pressure of competition among the elite. What you get is not a calm republic. You get something much closer to a game, a dangerous one, where the rules exist, but can be ignored, where alliances shift quickly, and where losing doesn't just mean losing power. Sometimes it means losing everything, so people adapted. They learned to play carefully. They learned to speak one way in public, and another way in private. They learned to hide their intentions, and most importantly, they learned how to survive. That's really what this story is about. Not just conspiracies, but survival. Because in Rome, survival often meant knowing what was really going on, even when no one said it out loud. And over time, this created a strange kind of culture, one where everyone understood that the official story wasn't always the full story, but they went along with it anyway, because questioning it too loudly could be risky. Imagine living in a place like that, where power is always shifting, where the truth depends on who is telling it, where yesterday's hero can become tomorrow's enemy, and where the line between rumor and reality is never completely clear. It's uncomfortable, a little unsettling, but also strangely familiar, because if we're being honest, this isn't just a story about ancient Rome. It's a story about power, and power, no matter the time or place, tends to behave in similar ways. It protects itself, it hides its weaknesses, and when necessary, it rewrites the story. So as we move forward, keep that in mind. Every event we're about to explore, every assassination, every scandal, every accident, ask yourself one simple question. Was that really what it seemed? Because in Rome it almost never was, and the deeper we go, the clearer that becomes. Next, we step into one of the most famous moments in history, a murder that everyone thinks they understand. A story told for over 2,000 years. Simple, clean, heroic, or at least that's how it was presented. But like everything else in Rome, there's more to it, a lot more. And once you see it, it's hard to unsee. Let's talk about Julius Caesar. Most people think they know this story. A powerful man rises too far, too fast. He becomes dangerous, a threat to freedom. So a group of brave men step in and stop him. Simple, clean, almost heroic. That's how the death of Julius Caesar has been told for a very long time. A tyrant, cut down to save the Republic. But if you slow the story down and look at it carefully, it starts to feel less like a heroic act and more like something else entirely. Let's begin with Caesar himself. By the time he returned to Rome in 44 BC, he wasn't just a general. He wasn't just a politician. He was the most powerful man in the Roman world. He had won a brutal civil war, defeated his rivals, and secured loyalty from his soldiers in a way few others ever had. People loved him, that's important. Because power in Rome didn't just come from laws, it came from support, and Caesar had a lot of it. Now officially, Rome was still a republic. No kings, no dictators. At least, not permanent ones, but Caesar had just been named dictator for life. That phrase alone made people nervous. Actually, more than nervous. It terrified the elite C. For generations, Rome's most powerful families had shared control. Not equally, of course, but enough to keep things balanced. No one man was supposed to dominate everything, and now, here was Caesar, a man who didn't just win power. He kept it so, the whispers began. He wants to be king. He's going to end the republic. He'll never give up power. Were those fears real, or were they convenient? That's where things get complicated, because when you look at what Caesar actually did, it doesn't fully match the panic. Yes, he centralized authority. Yes, he made decisions quickly. Yes, he accepted honors that made him look almost royal. But he also passed reforms, helped the poor, restructured debt, expanded citizenship. Too many ordinary Romans, he didn't look like a tyrant. He looked like someone fixing a broken system, and that made him even more dangerous, not because he was hated, but because he wasn't. Now, let's talk about the men who decided to kill him. At the center of it all was Marcus Junius, Brutus, a name that still carries weight today, often remembered as the tragic hero, the man who chose principle over loyalty. But Brutus wasn't just a philosopher, he was also a politician. From a powerful family, with a reputation to protect and something to gain. Then there was Gaius, Cassius Longinus, more direct, more forceful. He had fought against Caesar in the Civil War and lost, which meant he had already been on the wrong side of power once he knew what losing looked like, and he probably didn't want to experience it again. Together, they weren't alone, and far from it. More than 60 senators joined the plot. 60, and that's not a spontaneous act. That's coordination planning, agreement. Think about that for a second. This wasn't a desperate last-minute decision. This was organized carefully, quietly. Meetings would have happened behind closed doors. Alliances formed, risks calculated. Because killing a man like Caesar wasn't just dangerous, it was unpredictable. If they failed, they would all die. No speeches, no second chances, so why do it? Why take that risk? The official answer is simple: to save the Republic. That's what they said. That's what history repeated, but when historians look at it today, many see something else. Something less noble, because here's the uncomfortable truth. If Caesar had truly destroyed the Republic, killing him should have restored it, right? But that's not what happened. Not even close. After his death, Rome didn't return to balance. It collapsed further. More chaos, more violence, more power struggles, eventually leading to something even more extreme: an empire. So if the goal was to protect the Republic, it failed completely, which raises a difficult question. Was that ever the real goal? Some historians believe the answer is no, that this wasn't just about saving Rome. It was about control, because Caesar had changed the rules. He had shown that one man could rise above the system, and that threatened the old elite, the men who had always held power behind the scenes. So what do you do when someone disrupts the system that benefits you? You remove them, and then you control the story. That's exactly what happened next. After the assassination, the conspirators didn't hide. They didn't run, they walked out into the open and declared what they had done. They expected praise, celebration, gratitude. They didn't get it, the people of Rome didn't cheer. They were shocked, confused, angry, because to them, this didn't look like justice. It looked like murder, and that's when the narrative had to shift. Quickly, Caesar had to become a tyrant, not a reformer and not a leader. A threat because if he wasn't, then what they did becomes much harder to justify. So the story was shaped, repeated, polished over time by writers, by historians, by those who came after, and like many powerful stories, it stuck. But here's the thing, when you peel back the layers, when you compare sources, when you look at motives, outcomes, and consequences, the story doesn't feel so simple anymore. It starts to look like something else. Not just an assassination, but a political move. A calculated decision by a group of elites to remove a rival, a conspiracy. And one that, over time, has become harder and harder to ignore. Because the deeper historians dig, the more they see patterns, coordination, motivation, opportunity, all the elements you'd expect, and the more that old, clean version of the story starts to fade, leaving behind something more complicated, more human, and maybe more honest, because, in Rome, as we're starting to see, the truth wasn't always what people said it was, and this was only the beginning, because after Caesar's death, something even more remarkable happened. Someone stepped in quietly at first, carefully, a man who didn't just take power, but changed the way power looked forever, and the most interesting part, he convinced everyone that nothing had changed at all. Let's talk about Augustus. After the death of Julius Caesar, Rome didn't breathe a sigh of relief. It held its breath, because when a man like Caesar falls, power doesn't disappear, it waits. At first, everything looked uncertain. The conspirators thought they had restored the Republic, that things would go back to normal. They were wrong, very wrong, because into that chaos stepped a young man most people didn't take seriously, at least, not at first. His name was Octavian. Later, the world would know him as Augustus. Now, here's the interesting part. Augustus didn't charge into power like Caesar. He didn't announce himself as ruler. He didn't demand control. He eased into it. Quietly, carefully. Like someone who understood something very important. Rome didn't fear power. It feared the appearance of power. So instead of fighting that fear, he worked around it officially. Rome was still a republic. The Senate still met. Laws were still passed. Elections still happened. If you looked at the surface, nothing had changed. But underneath, everything had. Augustus held multiple key positions at once. He controlled the army, he influenced the Senate, he managed the flow of money, and most importantly, he shaped how people saw him, because Augustus didn't just build power. He built an image. He called himself princeps. It sounds modest. It means first citizen, not king, not emperor, just first among equals. That was the genius of it, because Romans hated kings. The word alone made people uncomfortable. It reminded them of a past they had rejected, so Augustus never used it. He didn't need to. Instead, he created something new. A system where one man held ultimate authority, but no one had to admit it out loud. And to make that system work, he needed more than control, he needed belief. This is where propaganda comes in, not the loud, obvious kind. The quiet kind, the kind that seeps into everything. Augustus invested heavily in stories, in art, in literature, in monuments. He didn't just want to rule Rome, he wanted to define what Rome was. Take the poets of his time, writers like Virgil. Virgil wrote the Aeneid, one of the most famous works in Roman history. On the surface, it's an epic about the founding of Rome, but underneath, it's something else. It connects Augustus to destiny, to the gods, to the very origins of Rome itself. It suggests that his rule wasn't just political, it was inevitable. That's powerful. Because if people believe something is meant to happen, they stop questioning it, and it didn't stop with poetry. Augustus rebuilt parts of the city, filled it with temples, statues, and inscriptions. Each one telling a story, each one reinforcing the same idea. Rome was strong again, and Rome was stable again, and Augustus made it happen. He even famously said that he found Rome a city of brick, and left it a city of marble. That line wasn't just pride, it was messaging, because marble lasts, and so do ideas. Now here's where it gets really interesting at the time. Some people noticed what was happening, they saw through it. They whispered, "This isn't a republic anymore. This is something else." But those voices didn't dominate the narrative, because Augustus controlled the narrative. Carefully, consistently, over time. And slowly, something strange happened. People accepted it. Not all at once, not loudly, but gradually the idea of the republic remained but the reality. It faded, and in its place, something new took hold. An empire, but here's the key detail. No one officially announced that change. There was no single moment where Rome said, "We are no longer a republic." It just happened, and that's what made Augustus so effective. He didn't break the system, he reshaped it so subtly that many people didn't even realize it was happening. For a long time, the official story held Rome was still a republic. Augustus was just a servant of the state, a protector of tradition. But as historians look back now, that story doesn't hold up, because when you examine the structure of power, when you follow the decisions, when you look at who truly had control, it becomes clear. Augustus wasn't restoring the republic, he was replacing it, and he did it so well that people believed the illusion. That's the conspiracy. Not in the sense of secret meetings in dark rooms, but in something more subtle, more effective, a shared understanding that wasn't spoken out loud. A system where everyone played their role, where the Senate acted like it had power, where the people believed in continuity, where Augustus ruled, without calling it rule, and for years, it worked. Peace returned, stability followed, Rome expanded, which made the illusion even stronger, because when things are going well, people don't question the system, but that doesn't mean the system was honest. It just means it was effective, and this is where the pattern becomes clear. From Caesar to Augustus, we're starting to see how Rome really operated. Not just through laws, but through perception. Not just through force, but through narrative. And once you understand that, everything else starts to make more sense, because the next stories we're about to explore, the deaths, the rumors, the quiet disappearances, they don't happen in isolation, they happen inside this system. A system where power is protected, where truth is flexible, and where the official story isn't always the real one, because even Augustus, the master of control, was surrounded by whispers. Whispers about people who got too close to power and didn't stay there for long. Let's take a closer look at what happened around him, because some of those deaths weren't as simple as they seemed in some of those rumors. They might not have been rumors at all. By the time Augustus settled into power, Rome looked calm, stable, almost peaceful after years of civil war. That alone felt like a miracle. But stability in Rome often came with a quiet cost, because power, once secured, has a new problem. It has to be maintained, and that's where things start to get uncomfortable. Augustus didn't just need control, he needed a future. A clear line of succession, someone to take over when he was gone. Now officially, Rome still didn't do kings. No crowns, no royal bloodlines, but in reality, everyone knew what was happening. This was becoming a dynasty. Whether they admitted it or not, Augustus had potential heirs. Young men positioned, carefully trained, promoted, watched closely. Two of the most important were Gaius Caesar and Lucius Caesar, his grandsons. His chosen successors, they were introduced to the public early, given titles, honors, visibility. It was subtle, but clear. These were the future leaders of Rome, and then they died, not together, not dramatically, but close enough in time to raise questions. Lucius Caesar died first, a sudden illness. Unexpected. He was young, healthy, important, and then gone. A few years later, Gaius Caesar followed officially. He died from wounds after a military campaign. But again, the timing felt strange to heirs, both gone. Before either could take power now, in any other situation, this might just be tragic coincidence. But this is Rome, and coincidences rarely stay simple. Because, with them gone, attention shifted to someone else, a man named Tiberius. Tiberius was experienced, capable, but not originally the first choice. In fact, for a while, he had stepped away from public life entirely, almost like he knew. He wasn't the favorite, and yet, somehow, he became the successor so naturally, people started to whisper. Not loudly, not publicly, but quietly. Was that really an accident? Two heirs, just gone like that. And now Tiberius rises. And then, there was another name that kept appearing in those whispers. Livia Drusilla. Livia was Augustus's wife, but more than that. She was politically sharp, careful, observant, the kind of person who didn't need to raise her voice to have influence, and importantly, she was also Tiberius's mother now. To be clear, there is no direct proof that Livia poisoned anyone. No document, no confession, no undeniable evidence, but the rumors. They never went away. Ancient writers suggested that she may have had a role in removing rivals, that she quietly cleared the path for her son at the time. Many dismissed these claims, said they were gossip, exaggeration, the kind of stories people tell when powerful figures succeed, a little too neatly, but modern historians don't dismiss them so easily, not because they can prove every detail, but because the pattern feels familiar in a system where power is everything, where succession isn't clearly defined, where ambition runs deep. Removing rivals isn't unthinkable. It's practical and poisoning. That wasn't rare in Rome. It wasn't even shocking. It was subtle, hard to trace, easy to deny, exactly the kind of method you'd expect in a world where appearances mattered. So when historians look back now, they don't necessarily say yes, this definitely happened, but they also don't say no, this is impossible. Instead, they sit somewhere in the middle, acknowledging that while we may never know the full truth, the suspicion itself tells us something important. It tells us how Romans understood power. Because people don't invent these kinds of rumors out of nowhere. They come from patterns, from expectations, from a sense that behind the official story, something else might be happening, and in Rome, that feeling wasn't unusual. Think about it, two young heirs, carefully prepared, publicly celebrated, gone, and in their place, a new successor, one with strong connections and a very powerful mother. It doesn't prove anything, but it raises questions, and in a system like Rome's, questions matter, because the official version of events is only one layer. Underneath it, there's always another, a quieter one, less certain, but often more revealing, and this is where the pattern becomes clearer from Caesar's death to Augustus's rise, to these mysterious losses. We keep seeing the same thing, power shifting, quietly, strategically, and always with a story to explain it. Sometimes that story is true, sometimes it's not. And sometimes it's just enough to keep people from asking too many questions, because in Rome, stability wasn't just about strength, it was about perception. As long as things looked under control, as long as the narrative made sense, people accepted it. Even if, deep down, they had doubts, and those doubts, they never fully disappeared, they lingered, in whispers and writings, in the quiet suspicion that maybe, just maybe, some of these deaths weren't as natural as they seemed, and if that's true, then it means something important. It means that even at the very top of Roman power, even in the most stable period of its history, the game was still being played. Carefully, quietly, and sometimes deadly, because the closer you get to power in Rome, the more dangerous it becomes, and not everyone who gets close gets to stay there next. We move into one of the most famous and most misunderstood figures in Roman history. A man blamed for one of the greatest disasters the city ever faced, of a fire, and a story, and a truth that isn't quite what it seems. Let's talk about Nero. If there's one Roman emperor almost everyone thinks they understand, it's Nero. Say his name, and the image appears instantly. A man watching Rome burn, maybe even playing music while the flames rise into the night. Calm, detached, almost entertained. It's a powerful image, dramatic, easy to remember, and like many stories about Rome, not entirely accurate. Let's slow it down, because the truth is a little more complicated, and honestly, a little more interesting. In the year 64 AD, a massive fire broke out in Rome. Not a small one, not something contained to a single neighborhood. This fire spread fast, fueled by wooden buildings, narrow streets, and crowded districts. For days, it moved through the city, destroying homes, temples, entire sections of Rome. People ran. Some tried to fight the flames. Others just tried to survive. By the time it was over, huge parts of the city were gone. Now here's where the story usually jumps. Nero started the fire, but here's the thing. There's no solid evidence that he did. In fact, some accounts say he wasn't even in Rome when the fire began. He was in a place called Antium, away from the city. And when he heard about the disaster, he came back. Not to celebrate, but to respond. According to several sources, Nero opened his gardens to refugees, provided food, helped organize relief efforts. Not exactly the behavior you'd expect from someone who just burned down his own city. So why does the story exist? Why do so many people believe he started it? Because something happened after the fire, something that changed how people saw him. Once the flames died down, Nero began rebuilding. And he didn't rebuild the city exactly as it was. He changed it. Wider streets, stricter building codes, more open space, less chance for another fire to spread so easily. From a practical standpoint, it made sense. But then, he did something else. He built a massive palace, right in the middle of Rome, on land that had just been cleared by the fire. It was called the Doma Soria, the Golden House, and it wasn't small. It stretched across a huge area, filled with luxury, gardens, artificial lakes, rooms covered in gold and precious materials. Now imagine you're a citizen of Rome. Your home is gone, your neighborhood is gone, and in its place, the emperor builds himself a palace. Suddenly, the story starts to shift. People begin to wonder, was this planned? Did he want this land? Did he need the fire? And just like that, a theory is born. Not necessarily based on proof, but on timing, on benefit, on suspicion. Because Nero didn't just survive the fire, he gained from it. And in a place like Rome, that matters. Now again, modern historians don't all agree that Nero started the fire. Most don't think there's enough evidence to say that. But here's where they do agree. He absolutely took advantage of it. The rebuilding plans, ambitious, strategic, the palace, unmistakably self-serving, and the changes to the city. They gave him more control over how Rome looked and functioned. So while he may not have lit the fire, he understood how to use it. And that's where the real story begins. Because sometimes, in Rome, the question isn't, did this person cause the event? It's, did they benefit from it? And if the answer is yes, then people start connecting dots, fairly or not. Now here's something else to consider. After the fire, Nero faced a problem. People were suspicious. Rumors were spreading. His reputation was unstable. And in Rome, perception matters a lot. So what do you do when people start blaming you for something like this? You redirect the blame, quickly, decisively. And that's exactly what Nero did. He found a group, a small one, unpopular, misunderstood, and he pointed to them. But we'll get into that in the next chapter, because that part of the story might be even darker than the fire itself. For now, let's sit with this. Nero, the emperor who burned Rome, might not have started the fire, but he didn't waste it either. He used it, shaped it, turned disaster into opportunity. And whether that was planned or just very convenient is something people have debated for centuries. But one thing is clear. The version of the story most people know is only part of the truth. And in Rome, that's usually how it works. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't the event itself. It's how that event gets used afterward. And Nero, he was very good at that. Next, we look at what happened when he needed to protect himself from the fallout. Because the fire may have destroyed Rome, but the response that followed, that revealed something even more chilling. A strategy, a pattern, one that would be used again and again. Blame, fear, and control. Let's talk about what happened next. After the fire, Rome wasn't just damaged, it was shaken. Entire neighborhoods were gone, families displaced, landmarks reduced to ash, and more than anything, people wanted answers. They wanted to know how this happened, who was responsible, and whether it could happen again. That kind of fear, it spreads fast. And in a city like Rome, fear can turn into something even more dangerous, anger. Now think about Nero for a moment. He's the emperor, the most powerful man in the empire. And suddenly, people are looking at him differently. Not with admiration, but with suspicion. Rumors are growing, whispers in the streets, quiet conversations behind closed doors. Maybe he started it. Maybe he wanted this. Maybe this wasn't an accident. Even if none of that was proven, it didn't matter, because perception in Rome was everything. And Nero was losing control of it, so he needed to act fast. He needed a new story, a better one that shifted attention away from him and towards someone else. That's when he made a decision. He chose a group, not a powerful group, not one that could fight back, but one that was already different. Early Christians. At the time, they were small, not well understood. They didn't worship the Roman gods. They met in private. They followed beliefs that seemed strange to outsiders. In other words, they were easy to blame. So Nero accused them, publicly, directly. He claimed they were responsible for the fire, that they had started it, that they were a threat to Rome itself. Now again, there's no real evidence that this was true. None. But that wasn't the point. The point was to redirect fear. Because when people are afraid, they look for someone to blame. And if you give them a target, they focus on that. It's simple, and it works. And in this case, it worked very well. Suddenly, the narrative shifted. The fire wasn't about Nero anymore. It wasn't about urban planning, or suspicious timing, or imperial ambition. It was about a group of outsiders, a hidden threat, an enemy within. And once that idea took hold, everything changed. Because now, Nero had justification. If Christians were responsible, then action had to be taken. Strong action. What followed was brutal. Arrests, interrogations, executions, not quiet ones either. Public spectacular, designed to send a message. Some accounts describe people being burned alive. Others talk about cruel punishments carried out in front of crowds. It wasn't just punishment, it was performance. A display of power, a warning. And for many Romans, it worked. Fear shifted, anger redirected. The emperor wasn't the problem anymore. The enemy was. Now here's where this becomes more than just a tragic story. Because what Nero did here fits a pattern, a very recognizable one. When a crisis happens and leadership is questioned, find someone else to blame. Make that blame convincing. Make it emotional, make it visible, and most importantly, make it loud. Because if people are focused on something else, they stop asking uncomfortable questions. At the time, some may have doubted the story, quietly but openly challenging it. That was risky, because once the state commits to a narrative, it doesn't like being questioned, and over time, that narrative becomes accepted, not because it's proven, but because it's repeated, again and again. And that's what makes this so significant. This isn't just about Nero or the fire. It's about something deeper. One of the earliest clear examples of a government using misinformation to protect itself. A conspiracy not in the sense of a hidden plot that never existed, but in the sense of a story deliberately shaped to hide something else. And today, historians widely agree on this part. Nero likely did not start the fire, but he almost certainly blamed Christians to protect his own position, which means the conspiracy people might have whispered back then that the blame was false. Wasn't so far off after all. It just took time for that truth to become clearer, and by then, the damage was already done. Lives lost, reputations destroyed, a narrative locked into place. Because once a story spreads, especially one backed by power, it's hard to undo, even if it isn't true. And that's something Rome understood very well, because controlling the story was often just as important as controlling the empire, maybe more. And as we move forward, you'll start to notice something. This wasn't a one-time thing. This idea of watching, controlling, shaping information. It didn't end with Nero. In fact, it became more organized, more structured, more deliberate. Because Rome didn't just rely on stories, it also relied on something else. Something quieter, less visible. People who listened, watched, reported. A system that many once thought was exaggerated, almost fictional, until it wasn't. Let's take a look at Rome's hidden network. Its eyes and ears. What some might call a secret police. When people think of surveillance, they usually imagine something modern. Cameras, phones, data. Something digital, advanced. Ancient Rome doesn't usually come to mind, but maybe it should. Because long before modern technology, Rome had already figured out something important. You don't need machines to watch people. You just need other people. And that's exactly what they used. They were called the frumentari, at least, officially. On paper, the frumentari had a simple job. They were responsible for grain supply, transporting food, handling logistics. Nothing suspicious, nothing secret. But that was just the surface. Because over time their role changed. Quietly, gradually, they started carrying messages, then information, then something more sensitive, and before long, they weren't just moving grain anymore. They were moving intelligence. The frumentarii became messengers between provinces and the emperor. They traveled constantly, across cities, across borders, across the entire empire. And that gave them something very valuable. Access. They could go almost anywhere. Speak to almost anyone. Observe things others couldn't. And in a system like Rome's, that kind of access doesn't stay innocent for long, because information is power. And once emperors realized that, the role of the frumentari expanded even further. They started watching people, not openly, not officially, but effectively. They monitored governors, kept an eye on generals, listened for signs of rebellion, and most importantly, they reported back, directly to the emperor. Now think about what that means. In a world without instant communication, without phones or written reports flying across the empire in seconds, the emperor still had eyes and ears everywhere. That's not an accident. That's a system. And for a long time, people weren't entirely sure how deep that system went. Some thought the idea of a Roman secret police was exaggerated, a bit dramatic, something historians added later to make the empire seem more intense than it really was. But the more evidence that surfaced, the clearer it became. This wasn't exaggerated, it was real. The frumentarii weren't just messengers. They were informants, observers, sometimes even enforcers. They could gather information quietly, and if necessary, act on it. That's where things start to feel a little more unsettling, because in a system like this, people don't always know when they're being watched. A conversation in a marketplace, a private discussion over dinner, a passing comment about the emperor, any of it could be overheard, reported, remembered. And when that happens, behavior changes. People become more careful, more cautious, more controlled, not because they're forced to, but because they're unsure. And uncertainty is powerful. It doesn't need to be constant surveillance. It just needs to feel possible. That's enough. Now imagine you're a senator, or a general, or anyone with influence. You know that information flows back to the emperor. You don't always know how, or when, or through whom, but you know it happens. So what do? You choose your words carefully. You watch your alliances. You think twice before speaking openly. In other words, you become easier to control. And that's the real power of a system like this. It doesn't just collect information. It shapes behavior. Quietly now. To be fair, the frumentarii weren't always efficient. They weren't everywhere all the time. This wasn't some perfect, all-seeing network, but it didn't have to be. Because even limited surveillance can have a wide effect. If people believe it's larger than it is, and in Rome, belief was everything. Over time, the reputation of the frumentarii grew. They became associated with fear, with control, with the emperor's unseen reach. Eventually, they were replaced by other groups, more specialized, more structured, but the idea remained. Rome had learned how to watch its own people, and once a system like that exists, it rarely disappears completely. Now here's where this ties back to our larger story. For a long time, the idea that Rome had anything like a secret police sounded a bit exaggerated, too modern, too organized, too intentional. But history suggests otherwise. Not in the exact form we imagine today, but in function, in purpose, very similar. And that's what makes it so interesting. Because once again, we see a pattern. Something that might have sounded like a conspiracy at the time. People are watching us. Information is being reported. The emperor knows more than he should. Turns out, those fears weren't completely unfounded. They were based on something real. And in a system like Rome's, that kind of reality changes everything. Because now, it's not just about power at the top. It's about awareness at every level. Who's loyal? Who's not? Who's watching? Who's listening? And when you combine that with everything we've already seen, propaganda, narrative control, political maneuvering, you start to understand how Rome stayed stable for so long, not just through strength, but through information, through quiet control, and sometimes through fear. Because in Rome, power didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just listened. And the more you look at it, the more one thing becomes clear. If information was this valuable, if silence was this important, then removing someone quietly would be even more effective. No speeches, no public drama, no witnesses, just a sudden death. And in Rome, that kind of thing happened more often than people like to admit. Let's talk about it. In Rome, not every enemy was killed in public. Not every conflict ended with a speech or a sword. Sometimes it ended quietly. A dinner, a drink, a sudden illness that didn't quite make sense, and then silence. Because in a world where appearances mattered, the cleanest way to remove someone was to make it look like nothing happened at all. This is where poison enters the story. Not as a rare tool, not as something shocking, but as something familiar. In the imperial court, poisoning wasn't some wild rumor people whispered about for entertainment. It was a known possibility, something people considered, prepared for, even feared. Think about the environment we've been building. A system full of ambition, unclear succession, constant competition, people rising quickly, falling just as fast. In that kind of world, open violence is risky. It draws attention, creates chaos, forces reactions. But poison is quiet, controlled, deniable. It doesn't need witnesses. It doesn't need a public explanation. All it needs is access. And in the imperial court, access wasn't hard to find. Food was prepared by servants, wine poured by attendants, meals shared in close, trusted circles, and trust, in Rome, was always a fragile thing. Now, to be clear, we don't have a complete record of every poisoning that ever happened, but we do have patterns, stories, accounts from historians who lived much closer to these events. And again, we see the same theme. Important figures dying unexpectedly. Not old, not weak, just suddenly gone, and often at very convenient times. A rival disappears. A political obstacle vanishes. A new opportunity opens up. Coincidence, maybe. But when it happens repeatedly, people start to notice. Take emperors themselves. Several Roman emperors are suspected to have been poisoned. Not confirmed in every case, but strongly suspected. And it's not just emperors, advisors, heirs, political allies. Anyone who stood in the way of someone else's rise could become a target. Now here's something important. Poisoning in Rome wasn't always random or desperate. It could be professional. There were individuals known for their knowledge of toxins, people who understood dosages, timing, effects. In other words, this wasn't guesswork. It was a skill, and like any skill in Rome, it could be bought. That alone tells you something about the system, because when a society reaches the point where silent killing becomes normalized, it means something deeper is happening. It means trust is breaking down. It means power isn't secured through law, but through elimination. And it means that survival depends not just on strength, but on caution. Imagine living in that environment. You're invited to dinner. You sit down. Food is served. Wine is poured. Everything looks normal. But in the back of your mind, there's a question. Can I trust this? That kind of thinking changes behavior. It makes people suspicious, guarded. It creates a culture where no one feels completely safe. And that's exactly the kind of environment where control becomes easier. Because when people are unsure, they hesitate. And hesitation can be the difference between survival and downfall. Now, like many things in Rome, stories of poison were sometimes exaggerated. Accusations could be used as political tools. Blaming someone for poisoning a rival was an easy way to damage their reputation. So not every claim is true. But not every claim is false either. And modern historians generally agree on this much. Poisoning did happen, frequently enough to matter. It wasn't the only method of removing rivals, but it was a reliable one, and in many cases, it was the preferred one, because it left room for doubt. No clear culprit, no dramatic scene, just a question, and in Rome, questions could be managed, explained away, rewritten, just like everything else. So when people in ancient times whispered things like, "Important people don't just die like that," they weren't necessarily imagining things. They were observing patterns. Patterns that, over time, became harder to ignore. And once again, we see the same idea appear. What might have sounded like conspiracy often had a foundation in reality. Not always in the exact way people described, but close enough to matter. Close enough to reveal how power really worked. Quietly, carefully, and sometimes fatally. Because in Rome, survival wasn't just about winning battles. It was about avoiding them. Avoiding attention. Avoiding suspicion. Avoiding the wrong meal. And as strange as it sounds, that may have been one of the most dangerous parts of Roman life. Not the wars, not the politics, but the silence. The quiet moments where everything seemed normal, right before it wasn't. And this brings us to another figure. Another story shaped by rumor, exaggeration, and maybe, just maybe, a deliberate distortion of truth. Because sometimes, instead of hiding power, Rome chose to reframe it, to turn a ruler into something else entirely. A monster, a madman. But was he really? Let's take a closer look at Caligula. If there's one Roman emperor who feels almost unreal, it's Caligula. You've probably heard the stories. He declared himself a god. He made his horse a consul. He acted wildly, unpredictably, dangerously. A ruler completely out of control, at least. That's the version we're given. But here's the question. What if that version isn't the full story? Because when you look closer, something starts to feel off. Most of what we know about Caligula comes from a handful of sources. Writers who lived during or after his reign. Men like Suetonius and Cassius Dio. And here's the important detail. They weren't neutral observers. They were part of the Roman elite. The same class that often had complicated relationships with emperors, especially emperors who didn't play by their rules. So when they describe Caligula as insane, we have to ask, is that objective or is it political? Now, to be fair, Caligula likely wasn't a perfectly stable ruler. There are accounts of erratic behavior, sudden decisions, moments that genuinely worried people around him. But there's also evidence that his reputation may have been exaggerated, shaped, because labeling a ruler as mad does something very useful. It explains everything. If a leader is insane, then their actions don't need deeper analysis. They don't need context. They become simple, dismissible, and more importantly, replaceable. Now, let's look at how Caligula's reign actually began. At first, he was popular. Very popular. He was young, charismatic, seen as a fresh start after the rule of Tiberius, who had become increasingly distant and unpopular. People welcomed Caligula, celebrated him. For a moment, things looked hopeful, and then something changed. Some sources say he fell seriously ill early in his reign, a sudden sickness that nearly killed him. After that, the tone of the story shifts. This is where the madness begins. Cruel decisions, strange behavior, growing tension with the Senate. But again, we have to be careful, because what looks like madness from one perspective can look like something else from another. For example, Caligula openly challenged the Senate. He humiliated senators, ignored traditions, made it clear that their authority didn't mean much to him. Now imagine you're part of that Senate, a group used to influence, to respect, to being part of power, and suddenly, the emperor treats you like you don't matter. How would you respond? Probably not kindly. And when that emperor is gone, you might have something to say about him, something memorable. Now let's talk about his death, because like many figures in Rome, Caligula didn't just fade away. He was assassinated, not by foreign enemies, not by rebels in distant provinces, but by people close to him, members of the Praetorian Guard, his own protectors. That alone tells you something, because the Praetorian Guard didn't act randomly. They were careful, strategic. If they decided to remove an emperor, there was usually a reason, or at least a benefit. Caligula's death wasn't chaotic. It was organized, and once he was gone, the narrative solidified. He wasn't just a bad ruler. He was a madman, a monster, a cautionary tale. But here's the interesting part. When historians today revisit these accounts, they start to notice patterns, exaggerations, contradictions, details that feel a little too dramatic. Like the story about his horse becoming a consul. Did it actually happen, or was it symbolic? A way to mock the Senate? We don't know for sure. But we do know that stories like that are effective. They stick. They spread. They define how a person is remembered. And once a reputation like that takes hold, it's hard to change. So here's the possibility. What if Caligula wasn't simply insane? What if he was unpredictable? Yes, difficult, probably, but also a ruler who challenged the system in ways that made powerful people uncomfortable. And what if, after his death, that discomfort turned into something else? A story, one that made him easier to dismiss, easier to explain, and easier to forget. Because if Caligula was just mad, then no one has to ask deeper questions. No one has to wonder about power struggles, about political tension, about why the people closest to him decided he had to go. It becomes simple, and in Rome, simple stories were often the most useful ones. Now, this doesn't mean every story about Caligula is false, but it does mean we should be careful about accepting them at face value, because once again, we see the same pattern, a narrative shaped after the fact, a reputation built by those who survived, and a version of events that may not tell the whole truth. Which brings us to something even more revealing, because Caligula's death wasn't just about one emperor. It highlighted something bigger, a group operating in the background, a group with the power to make and unmake rulers, quietly, decisively, and sometimes for their own benefit. Let's talk about the real power behind the throne, the men who didn't wear crowns, but could decide who did. The Praetorian Guard. If Rome had a heartbeat, it wasn't in the Senate. It wasn't in the speeches. And it definitely wasn't in the laws carved into stone. It was somewhere else. Behind the scenes, in barracks, in corridors, in quiet conversations that never made it into official records. Because while emperors ruled Rome, they didn't always control it. For that, you have to look at a group of men who were supposed to protect the emperor, but ended up doing something far more powerful: the Praetorian Guard. At first glance, their role seems simple. Elite soldiers, hand-picked, stationed close to the emperor. Their job, keep him safe. But in Rome, roles have a way of expanding, especially when they come with proximity to power. Because the closer you are to power, the more you start to understand how it works. And once you understand it, you realize something important. The emperor may sit at the top, but he's not untouchable. Not really. And the Praetorian Guard knew that better than anyone. They weren't just soldiers, they were insiders. They controlled access to the emperor. They decided who got close, who got heard, who got ignored, and over time, that kind of control changes things. Because power isn't just about making decisions. It's about influencing who gets to make them. Now think about the position they were in. They lived near the emperor, protected him daily, watched his habits, his routines, his weaknesses. If anyone knew how vulnerable an emperor could be, it was them. And eventually, that knowledge turned into leverage. Let's go back to Caligula for a moment. His assassination wasn't carried out by distant enemies. It wasn't a rebellion from the outside. It came from within. Members of the Praetorian Guard, men who were trusted, men who were close, men who had access. That alone is enough to change how you see things. Because if the emperor's own protectors can turn on him, then what does power really mean? It means something fragile, something conditional, something that depends not just on authority, but on loyalty. And loyalty, in Rome, was never guaranteed. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. After Caligula was killed, Rome didn't immediately stabilize. There was confusion, fear, uncertainty. No clear successor, no plan that everyone agreed on. And in that moment of chaos, the Praetorian Guard stepped in, not to restore order, not to protect tradition, but to choose the next emperor. They found a man hiding, literally hiding, Claudius. He wasn't the obvious choice. He wasn't a powerful general. He wasn't a dominant political figure. In fact, many had overlooked him. But the guard didn't overlook him. They saw something else. An opportunity. They pulled him out, declared him emperor, and just like that, he became ruler of Rome. Think about how strange that is. The most powerful position in the empire, decided not by the Senate, not by the people, but by a group of soldiers. And it didn't stop there. Because once the Praetorian Guard realized they could do this, they didn't forget it. They remembered, and they used it again and again. Over time, a pattern formed. Emperors rose and fell, often with the involvement of the guard. Sometimes they protected the emperor, sometimes they removed him, and sometimes they went even further. There's one moment in Roman history that almost sounds unbelievable. After the assassination of Emperor Pertinax in 193 AD, the Praetorian Guard did something no one expected. They auctioned off the empire. Literally, they offered the position of emperor to the highest bidder, and a man named Didius Julianus won. He promised them money, a lot of it, and in return they gave him power. Just like that. No grand speeches, no divine signs, no approval from the Senate that actually mattered. Just a transaction. Power sold. Now imagine hearing that as a Roman citizen. The empire, this massive, complex system, reduced to a financial deal. It's almost absurd, but it happened, and it reveals something important. By this point, the illusion was cracking. The idea that Rome was guided by law, tradition, and order was becoming harder to believe, because behind the scenes, something else was clearly at work. A system where power could be influenced, bought, taken. If you were close enough, strong enough, connected enough. And the Praetorian Guard sat right in the center of that system. They weren't just participants, they were gatekeepers. They could make an emperor, they could unmake one, and they didn't need public approval to do it. Now, to be fair, they didn't always act alone. They had their own internal politics, divisions, conflicts, and sometimes they backed the wrong person, which led to even more chaos. But the key point remains. They had power. Real power, not the kind written in laws. The kind that actually changes outcomes. And for a long time, people underestimated that. They saw the emperor as the center, the ultimate authority. But slowly, over time, that perspective began to shift. Because when emperors kept dying, when leadership kept changing suddenly, when decisions didn't match the official structure, people started to notice. They started to ask questions. Who's really in control? And the answer wasn't always comfortable, because it suggested something deeper. That Rome's system wasn't as stable as it looked, that power wasn't as secure as it seemed, and that behind every emperor, there were forces shaping events. Quietly. Now historians today are very clear on this point. The Praetorian Guard played a major role in imperial politics. Not just as protectors, but as influencers, and sometimes executioners, which means that what might have sounded like conspiracy at the time, the emperor is just a puppet. The real power is somewhere else. Wasn't entirely wrong. It was an exaggeration, maybe. But it was rooted in truth, because while emperors held authority, They didn't always hold control, and that distinction matters a lot because it changes how we understand everything that follows. Every decision, every assassination, every sudden shift in leadership. It forces us to look beyond the surface, to ask not just what happened, but who benefited and who had the power to make it happen. Because in Rome, that answer wasn't always obvious. It wasn't always written down, but it was there, hidden in patterns, in repeated events, in the quiet understanding that maybe, just maybe, the man on the throne wasn't the only one pulling the strings. And once you start to see that, you can't really unsee it, because the empire begins to look different, less like a perfectly ordered system, and more like a balance, a shifting one between visible authority and invisible influence. And sometimes that balance breaks completely, which is exactly what happened next, because there was a moment in Roman history where everything moved so fast, so violently, that the illusion couldn't hold anymore. A year where power changed hands again and again, where loyalty meant survival, and where the truth became impossible to pin down. A year that revealed, more clearly than ever, how Rome really worked. Let's step into that chaos. The year when everything fell apart. The year of the 4 emperors. There are moments in history where everything slows down, where systems hold steady, where power looks stable. And then there are moments where everything breaks. For Rome, one of those moments came in the year 69 AD. Later, historians would give it a name that sounds almost too dramatic to be real. The year of the 4 emperors. But here's the thing. It's not dramatic enough, because what happened during that year wasn't just chaos. It was exposure. It showed, more clearly than ever, how power in Rome actually worked. Not in theory, not in speeches, but in reality. And once you see it, you can't really go back to the old version. Let's start at the beginning. The emperor at the time was Nero. By this point, his rule was already unstable. The fire, the accusations, the growing distrust, all of it had weakened his position, and eventually it caught up to him. Rebellions started to form. Governors in distant provinces began to question his authority. And here's the key detail. They didn't just complain, they acted. One of those governors was Servius Sulpicius Galba. He declared himself emperor. Now pause for a second. Think about how bold that is. In a system where the emperor is supposed to be the center of power, a provincial governor just says, "No, I'm in charge now," and people listen. That alone tells you something. Power in Rome wasn't fixed. It could shift if you had support, and Galba did, at least at first. Nero, facing growing pressure, made a decision. He fled, and soon after he died. Just like that, the emperor was gone. No smooth transition, no clear plan, just a vacuum. And in that vacuum, everything started to move. Galba entered Rome as the new emperor. But here's the problem. Gaining power is one thing. Keeping it is another. Galba didn't have strong support from the Praetorian Guard. And as we've already seen, that matters a lot. So when he refused to reward them the way they expected, things changed. Fast. The guard turned against him, and in a move that's becoming familiar, they removed him. Violently, Galba was killed. Not by foreign enemies, not by some distant conspiracy, but right there, in Rome. And just like that, a new emperor stepped in. Now here's where things start to feel almost surreal. Otho didn't rise through a long, stable process. He essentially bought the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard, promised them rewards, gained their support, and took power. Quickly, almost casually. But while all of this was happening in Rome, something else was happening far away, in the provinces. Another man was watching, another man with an army, Vitellius, and he had his own idea. Why should Otho be emperor? Why not him? So he marched, with legions behind him. Because in Rome, armies didn't just defend the empire, they decided it. What followed was conflict. Real conflict, not whispers. Not quiet political maneuvering, open war. Otho and Vitellius clashed, and Otho lost. Instead of dragging the conflict out, he made a decision. He ended his own life to prevent further bloodshed. At least, that's how it's often presented. And just like that, Vitellius became emperor. That's three. 3 emperors in 1 year. And we're not done yet. Because while Vitellius was celebrating his victory, another force was rising. In the east, a general named Vespasian. He had something very important. Support from his troops. From key regions. From people who believed he could do better. So he made his move. Not immediately, not recklessly, but strategically. He gathered strength, built alliances, waited for the right moment, and then he advanced. What followed was another conflict, another shift. And once again, the sitting emperor fell. Vitellius was defeated, captured, killed, and finally, Vespasian took control. For emperors, 1 year. Now take a step back. Look at that sequence. Nito Galba, Otho Vitellius, Vespasian. 5 names. Technically, but for transitions. And ask yourself something simple. Does that look like a stable system? Does that look like a republic guided by law? Or even an empire guided by clear succession? Not really. It looks like something else. It looks like power being decided in real time by whoever had the most support, the strongest army, the right alliances, and sometimes the backing of the Praetorian Guard. Because notice something. At no point in this year did the Senate truly control what happened. They reacted. They confirmed decisions after the fact, but they didn't drive them, which again raises that question. Who was really in charge? And the answer is complicated, because it wasn't just one group. It was a combination. Armies, guards, generals, political elites, all interacting, all competing, all trying to shape the outcome. And that's the reality that this year exposes. Rome wasn't controlled by a single, stable system. It was held together by balance, a fragile one, and when that balance broke, everything moved fast. Now, for people living at the time, this must have felt incredibly uncertain. Imagine waking up one day under one emperor, and a few months later, there's someone new. Different policies, different loyalties, different expectations. It's not just confusing, it's destabilizing, because it makes one thing very clear. Power isn't fixed. It's contested, constantly, and if it can change this quickly, then it's never truly secure. Now here's why this matters for our story. Because at the time, some people might have believed that Rome was still guided by structure, by tradition, by rules. But this year, it destroys that illusion completely. It shows that beneath everything, the speeches, the laws, the titles, power comes down to something much simpler. Control. Who has it? Who can take it? Who can hold it? And once again, we see that idea we've been building. What might have sounded like conspiracy. Rome is controlled by military power. The emperor is only as strong as his support. The system is unstable behind the scenes. Turns out, those ideas weren't far off. They were observations, accurate ones. And the year of the 4 emperors proved it. Not quietly, not subtly, but all at once, in a way that no one could ignore. Because when power changes hands 4 times in a single year, the truth becomes very hard to hide. And that truth is simple. Rome wasn't as stable as it looked. It never really was. It just did a very good job of appearing that way. But even after this chaos, the empire didn't collapse. It adapted. It stabilized again, at least on the surface, because underneath, the same patterns remained. Control, influence, competition, and something else. Something quieter, less visible. Money, because while armies and politics shaped power on one level, there was another force working behind the scenes, a system that affected everything. From provinces to governors, from taxes to loyalty, a system that many once dismissed as exaggeration. until the evidence became too strong to ignore. Because if you really want to understand Rome, you don't just follow the power, you follow the money. Let's take a closer look. If power in Rome was unstable, money made it worse. Because while emperors rose and fell, while armies clashed and alliances shifted, there was something else moving quietly underneath it all. Wealth, not the kind you see in gold statues or grand buildings, but the kind that flows through systems, through people, through decisions that don't always make it into official records. Because Rome didn't just run on power, it ran on money. And the way that money moved wasn't always clean. Now officially, Rome had a structured system. Taxes were collected, resources were distributed, governors were assigned to manage provinces. It all sounded organized, controlled, but once again, that's the surface. Underneath, things looked very different. Let's start with the provinces. These were the regions outside Rome itself, places that the empire controlled. They were essential. They provided food, resources, taxes. In many ways, they kept Rome running. And overseeing these provinces were governors, men appointed to manage, protect, and organize. At least, officially. Because in reality, being a governor was something else. It was an opportunity, a very profitable one. See, governors had a lot of power. They controlled taxation. They oversaw local economies. They had influence over legal decisions. And most importantly, they were far away from Rome, which meant less oversight, less immediate accountability. And in that kind of environment, things tend to drift. Because when you have power, and access to wealth, and limited supervision, the temptation is obvious. Take more, and many did. This system was called tax farming. Instead of the state collecting taxes directly, private individuals or groups would pay Rome for the right to collect taxes themselves. Think about that for a second. They paid up front, then went into the provinces, and collected as much as they could. Anything beyond what they owed Rome, they kept. Now imagine how that plays out. If you're a tax collector, your goal isn't fairness, it's profit. The more you take, the more you earn. And if the people you're taxing can't really fight back, well, you can probably guess what happens. Taxes go up, pressure increases, abuse becomes common, and all of it can be justified, because technically it's legal. Now combine that with governors. Some were responsible, some tried to maintain order, but others, they saw the system for what it was, a chance to build wealth, quickly, before their term ended, because that's another key detail. Governors didn't stay in power forever. They had limited time, which meant they had limited time to take advantage of the position. And that creates a very specific kind of behavior. Short-term thinking. Maximize gain. Worry about consequences later, if at all. Now, Rome wasn't completely blind to this. There were laws against excessive corruption, trials, accusations. Some governors were even prosecuted for abuse. But here's the problem. Those trials often happened after the damage was done. And even then, convictions weren't guaranteed, because the people judging these cases were often part of the same elite system, the same network of influence, which means outcomes could be flexible. And once again, we see the pattern. Official structure, unofficial reality. Now here's where it gets more interesting. At the time, people complained about this. wrote about it, spoke about it. There were accusations that Rome's wealth came at the expense of its provinces, that corruption was widespread, systemic. But like many things we've talked about, those claims were sometimes dismissed, seen as exaggerations, complaints from the losing side, or just the normal grumbling of people under pressure. But modern historians, they tend to agree on this. Corruption wasn't rare. It was common, built into the system itself. Not always openly, not always officially, but functionally, yes. Because when a system allows individuals to profit from control without strong oversight, corruption isn't an exception. It's an outcome. Now think about how this connects to everything else we've seen. Power struggles, assassinations, political maneuvering. All of that requires resources. Money. You need it to build alliances, to support armies, to secure loyalty. So where does that money come from? Often from the provinces. From systems like tax farming, from exploitation, from quiet ongoing extraction, and that creates a cycle. Wealth fuels power. Power enables more wealth, and the system reinforces itself. Now imagine being an ordinary person in a province. You're not part of the elite. You don't sit in the Senate, but your life is affected by their decisions. Taxes rise, resources are taken, and the people in charge, they leave after a few years, richer than when they arrived. That kind of experience shapes perception. It creates resentment, distrust, and sometimes rebellion, which of course Rome then has to deal with, often with force. So, in a strange way, the system creates its own problems, and then responds to them again and again. Now here's the key idea. For a long time, the notion that Rome was deeply corrupt might have sounded like exaggeration. Too cynical, too harsh. But the evidence tells a different story. Not every official was corrupt. Not every province was abused equally. But the pattern, it's there. Clear enough that historians don't ignore it. And that's what makes it important for our larger theme. Because once again, something that might have sounded like a conspiracy. Rome's wealth comes from exploitation. The system is rigged for the elite. Corruption is everywhere. Turns out, there's truth to it. Not in every detail. Not in every case. But enough to matter. Enough to change how we see the empire. Because instead of a perfectly ordered system, we start to see something more complex. A structure that works, but not always fairly. A system that functions, but with hidden costs, and those costs aren't always visible at the center. In Rome itself, things can look stable, prosperous, but far away. In the provinces, the reality can be very different, and that difference matters, because it reminds us that power isn't just about control at the top, it's about impact at every level. And in Rome, that impact wasn't always positive. Now, while all of this was happening, while money flowed and corruption spread, there was still one place that was supposed to represent balance. A place where decisions were debated, where power was shared, where Rome's future was shaped through discussion. At least that's how it was presented. The Senate. But as we're about to see, even that wasn't quite what it seemed. If you asked a Roman what made their system special, they would probably say one word. The Senate. It sounded impressive, old, respected. A body of experienced men guiding the state, debating laws, shaping the future of Rome. It gave the whole system a sense of balance. Even when emperors rose to power, the Senate remained, a symbol that Rome was still, in some way, a republic at least. That's how it looked. But like so many things in Rome, the reality was more complicated, because by the time the empire fully took shape, the Senate wasn't really in control anymore. Not in the way people imagined. It still met, still debated, still passed decrees, but those actions didn't always mean what they seemed. To understand this, you have to separate two things: appearance and power. The Senate had appearance. It had history, tradition, ceremony. It looked important, but real power, that was somewhere else, usually with the emperor. Now, this didn't happen overnight. In the early days of Rome, the Senate mattered a lot. It guided decisions, influenced policy, balanced authority. But over time, as emperors like Augustus reshaped the system, that balance shifted carefully. Quietly, the Senate wasn't abolished. That would have caused backlash. Instead, it was absorbed. Its role changed. It became part of the system, without controlling it. And this is where things get interesting, because the Senate still felt powerful. Senators still held status, wealth, influence in certain areas. But when it came to major decisions, war, succession, imperial policy, their role was limited. Sometimes they advised, sometimes they approved, but often they followed. And that creates a strange situation, because from the outside, everything looks functional. Debates happen, votes are taken. It feels like a working system. But underneath, the outcome is often already decided. That's why some historians describe the Senate during the imperial period as stage, a place where politics was performed, not always where it was decided. Now, to be fair, the Senate wasn't completely powerless. It still had influence, especially in areas where the emperor chose not to intervene directly, and individual senators could still be important. But the key word here is could, because their power depended on something else, the emperor's approval, and that changes everything. Because if your influence depends on someone else's favor, it's not fully yours. It's conditional, which means it can be taken away at any time. And in Rome, it often was. Senators who spoke too boldly, who challenged authority too directly, could find themselves in trouble, sometimes publicly, sometimes quietly. And when that happens enough, people learn, they adjust, they become more careful, less confrontational, more cooperative, not necessarily because they agree, but because they understand the risk. Now imagine being part of that system. You sit in the Senate, you wear the robe, you participate in debates, but deep down, you know that certain lines can't be crossed. Certain topics can't be pushed too far. Certain decisions are already made. That creates a kind of tension between what the Senate is supposed to be and what it actually is. And over time, that tension becomes normal. People accept it. They play their roles because the system still functions, just not in the way it's presented. Now here's where this ties into our larger theme. At the time, some people noticed this. They saw that the Senate wasn't as powerful as it appeared. They questioned whether Rome was still truly a republic. But those ideas weren't always taken seriously. They could be dismissed. After all, the Senate still existed, still met, still made decisions. So how could it be powerless? But modern historians, they look at the evidence differently. They examine who actually made key decisions, who controlled the military, who influenced succession, and the answer becomes clearer. The Senate was not the center of power. It was part of the structure, but not the core. And that's an important distinction, because it means that one of the most recognizable symbols of Roman governance was, in many ways, an illusion, not completely fake, but not fully real either. A system that looked balanced, while operating differently behind the scenes. And once again, we see the same pattern. Appearance on the surface, reality underneath. A narrative that holds everything together, even when it doesn't fully reflect what's happening. Because in Rome, stability wasn't just about control. It was about perception. As long as the system looked legitimate, as long as traditions were maintained, people accepted it, even if the true balance of power had shifted. And this is what makes the Senate such an important piece of the puzzle, because it shows how Rome managed change, not by destroying old systems, but by reshaping them, keeping the form, changing the function, so that everything felt familiar, even when it wasn't. Now, if you combine this with everything we've already seen, propaganda, surveillance, political maneuvering, corruption, you start to see a complete picture. A system that operates on multiple levels, one visible, one hidden, and both working together. Because the visible system builds trust, and the hidden system maintains control. And as long as those two stay aligned, the empire holds. But here's the thing. Maintaining that balance isn't easy. It requires constant effort, constant adjustment, and sometimes something more. Because while politics and power shape behavior, there's another force that can shape belief itself. Something deeper, more personal. Something that doesn't just influence what people do, but what they believe is right. Because in Rome, even religion wasn't always separate from power. In fact, it became one of its most effective tools. Let's take a closer look at how that worked, because what comes next might be one of the most subtle forms of control in the entire empire, and one that many people didn't even question. The worship of emperors, the cult of the emperor. And just like that, we've uncovered some of the most shocking conspiracy theories from ancient Rome that turned out to be real. It really makes you wonder how many more secrets are still buried beneath ruins, lost in time, or hidden in texts we haven't fully understood yet. If you enjoyed diving into these hidden truths, make sure to like the video. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next deep dive into history's most fascinating mysteries. I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Which theory surprised you the most? Or is there another ancient mystery you think we should cover next? And if you're not ready to leave just yet, check out the next video on your screen. We've got even more incredible stories waiting for you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.